You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron, live with Athan Hristodulu.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the Greeks Gridiron. I am Athan Hristodulu, and today we are discussing the top 5 cornerbacks heading into the 2021 season of the NFL. This was I don't want to say a super difficult list to make because there was a handful of names I knew when I started prepping this one that I wanted to put on the list, but it felt like there was, I would say arguably the top 5 is really hard to decide, and it really boils down to I guess what you would consider important and not. But overall, I think the top 5 or so cornerbacks really stand out in the league. There are some people you could argue in those 4 and 5 spots that I think personally are ranked number 6, 7th, 8th, 9th in the league. And I do want to give some honorable mentions out. We will be ranking them worst to first. Well, not worst to first, I guess. Thinking of my power rankings video here. But we're going to be ranking them from 5 to 1. So for my honorable mentions, before we start diving into the list with number 5, I just want to shout out cornerbacks Kenny Moore, Tre'Davious White, and Stephon Gilmore. Those were 3 of the big names that, I was kind of trying to decide, could I slip any of them into the 5 or 4 spot? All 3 of those cornerbacks have had, sustained success for numerous years now at this point. Stephon Gilmore just a few years ago was the best cornerback in the league. He won defensive MVP. But his play has fallen off. Tre'Davious White had a little bit of a down year for his standards. What his down year was a very good year for other players. And then Kenny Moore, arguably one of the best slot cornerbacks in the league, a favorite of mine as he is a Colt. But I just wanted to give some honorable mentions to those guys. I'm also going to shout out someone like J.C. Jackson, who really came on late in the year last year. He started to really come on, especially when Stephon Gilmore was he was missing time due to his injuries. But at the end of the day, I really tried to look at who's the number 1 corner of the team, and that was the person I would consider for this. The Patriots have such a wild group of corners right now, and Stephon Gilmore, Jonathan Jones, and J.C. Jackson. I mean, any of those guys really emerging as far as the younger 2 go. Stephon Gilmore potentially, in my opinion, could be, just a little bit on the wrong side of 30 and maybe is going to be slowing down. Obviously, last year wasn't his best, but you never really know how things turn out. He could make me completely eat my words and be at the top of the list at the end of the season. But those are my honorable mentions. Now, starting in with the number 5 cornerback that I have selected here, I am going to go with cornerback Marlon Humphrey from the Baltimore Ravens. Now, I have a bunch of statistics listed off here for all the cornerbacks. I have snaps taken listed, targets, reception percentage allowed, pass breakups, yards allowed, touchdowns allowed, interceptions, forced fumbles, their passer rating. So I have a bunch of statistics on here. I also considered sustained success. So, I wasn't just going to pick somebody to put on this list because they had one fantastic year. I'm looking at, okay, this is somebody who's been good for the last few years, had another strong year, and is probably going to have another strong year or even stronger year going into the following season. So with Marlon Humphrey sitting over here at number 5, I know some Ravens fans probably think, what do you mean? He's probably supposed to be in the top 3. Well, the biggest glaring issue that I had with him on this list is that he allowed an 89 passer rating. This is the highest on the top 5 list of the 5 people I have on here. On top of that, he also has the highest yardage allowed, but his turnovers, forced fumbles, he has 9, which is absurd for a cornerback. It reminds me of somebody like Tim Jennings from back in the day. On top of that, he also had an interception. He did allow a tied high list of 4 touchdowns on here. There is somebody else who matched him for the 4 touchdowns, but I mean, he also leads with the highest reception percentage. He had 118 targets, which is the highest amongst the 5 that are on this list as well. He was targeted significantly more than the next person above that is going to be above him later on in the list. So, ultimately what it really boiled down to was his coverage game was not as strong as everyone else. He's a fantastic tackler. He still made a lot of turnovers, but his coverage game was just not as strong. And the one thing that I want to point out about this list is I know that these cornerbacks all faced different wide receivers. You can't really do anything about that. That's one of the things I did think I wanted to, really dive into is who do they go against? But ultimately at the end of the day, these players don't get to pick who they're going to be going up against. The point of the matter is, did they do their job, and did they do their job well, regardless of who they were playing with? So, and I am averaging the totals from the entire season on these lists here. So I figured, don't really discredit or credit anyone for who they faced, because at the end of the day, they have 16 games, now 17 games that they have to play in where they need to be an elite level cornerback to be on this list, regardless of who they're playing. Now, coming in at number 4, this was a guy that I think quietly had a very strong year, and he has been very good for the last handful of years as well. And, he did an awesome job over in New York. I have number 24, James Bradberry of the New York Giants. He was targeted a total of 78 times, which is actually third lowest on the list. He also played a total of 1,021 snaps, and pretty much everyone on this list is somebody who's played like 1,000 plus snaps. So, we looked at, were they playing often, because some of the people's averages, they only had like 600 snaps, so their numbers would be overblown. I really took into consideration how many snaps they were playing, how many times were they targeted, things like that. Were they the number one cornerback on their team facing, assumingly the best corner on that team as well, best wide receiver of the opposing team as well. He had a very low 56.4 reception percentage, which I believe is it is the 4th highest on the list. He had 14 total pass breakups, 454 yards, which is the 3rd lowest on the list. 3 touchdowns allowed, but he also had 3 picks, 2 forced fumbles, and he allowed a passer rating of 70.1, which is a very strong number there. Overall, I think James Bradberry is an excellent corner coming over from Carolina into New York. He ended up being a great fit for this team, and with Adoree Jackson coming in and some other pieces over there in New York, the secondary is looking to be in a very good place for the Giants. I think James Bradberry has, been very consistent the last few years, and I think he's going to continue to do so at least for the next couple of years as well. And I think that he did not get quite the recognition he deserved just because of the fact of the team that he was on went 6-10 last year. He's going to be a big reason for why this defense continues to be so solid, because I'll say this right now, the Giants' problems last year was definitely not their defense. It was the offense. And, James Bradberry was a very big proponent as to why that defense was so good, manning down that number 1 corner position on that team. Now, coming in at number 3, this was more of like I wanted to put him a little bit higher, but the people that I have listed above him, I think I just had a really hard time not putting them in the top 2 slots. But he had a phenomenal year. He, was hurt the year prior and had a phenomenal year the year before that as well. I got to give a shout out to Xavien Howard here at number 3. He had 90 total targets. He allowed only 52.2% completion percentage. He had 10 total pass breakups. He did allow a very high 695 yards, but he was targeted second most on the list, which makes a little bit sense. On top of that, he allowed 4 touchdowns, which is tied for the highest on the list, but the man had 10 interceptions. He also had a forced fumble, and on top of that, he had and this is a list low, of a 53 passer rating in his direction. So, you want to talk about a guy who has really just stormed into the league. It was unfortunate he only got to play 5 games last year, because this past year, and then the year prior to last, he has 17 total interceptions as a corner. Talk about efficiency, talk about having a nose for the football, and just being a turnover machine and a lockdown cornerback, allowing a 53 passer rating when the ball comes his way. That's the numbers don't lie. If you've seen the way Xavien Howard plays, he is definitely one of the top emerging corners in the league, if not one of the top at this point. And I personally, in my opinion, think that he is the number 3 guy in the league. Now, the number 2 and 1 spots, I'm going to go ahead and say this real quick. The number 2 and 1 spots were a little bit tricky to decide. I have my opinion on who I truly think is the number 1. I know there's going to be, because the 1 and 2 guys, I'm very curious to see what everyone else thinks. For me, I think there's 2 clear-cut number 1 and 2 cornerbacks in the league, and it's Jalen Ramsey and Jaire Alexander. And if you think it's anyone else, I'm going to lay out the stats here for you in a second, because, these guys are just phenomenal when it comes to the ball coming their way and shutting it down. But it was tough to try to decide who was going to get the number 1 spot, who was going to get the number 2 spot. And I'm going to go ahead and stick Jalen Ramsey over at the number 2 position. Now, this is a guy that a lot of people will look at and say he is the best cornerback in the league. And do not get me wrong. When I think of a top-tier cornerback, I think of Jalen Ramsey, but I also think of Jaire Alexander. Jalen Ramsey, from the 75 targets he had, which is the lowest on the list, he has a total of 53.3% completion percentage. He had 9 pass breakups. He only allowed 396 yards, so not even 4 football fields worth of yards allowed for him. 3 touchdowns allowed. He only had 1 interception and 0 forced fumbles. He did allow a passer rating, though, of 76.3, which is a little bit higher than who I have coming up after him on the list. But, when it comes down to, top-tier cornerbacks, I'll say this. For me, right at this moment, it's 1 and 2, and then like a group of the rest, and then like the tier below that as well. I think Jaire Alexander and Jalen Ramsey are the 2 top guys on this, or just in the league in general, and on this list, obviously. But you can't go wrong with either one. I'm going to go ahead, flip it over now to my number 1 pick, Jaire Alexander. I mean, this is a guy who has come on and just gotten better and better and better each and every year. And on a defense that is literally Jaire Alexander in the secondary and then about everybody else at that point, I mean, the guys had 76 targets. He allowed, this is a list low here, of 48.7% completion percentage. He had 14 pass breakups, so he's in there, tied for the high on the list on this number. Allowed only 3.5 football fields at 353 yards. 2 touchdowns. He had 3 picks, a forced fumble, so he had 4 turnovers, and an absurd 54.3 passer rating in his direction. I would love to see people argue who is the top anything at any position. I am going to enjoy seeing people argue this in the comment section down below, because I think that this one might be controversial for some people. It might not be for other people, but in my opinion, I know a lot of people look at Jalen Ramsey as the number 1, but damn, has Jaire Alexander looked good. And if you watched any of his games from last year, and I did watch a handful of Packers games, I mean, it's just, he's a lockdown cornerback, does not really let a lot get by him. And I mean, he can force the turnovers. He gets in there to break up passes. I mean, he does everything so well in terms of coverage. He's a pretty solid tackler as well. He does everything you could ask for from a cornerback. And shout out to Jaire. I was not really sure who I was going to put at the number 1 and 2 spot on this list. These were the 2 guys I was rolling around in my head for a while. But I mean, I had to edge out Jaire Alexander just because the stats are so good in his favor. But I would love to know what you guys think in the comment section down below. This is my top 5 cornerbacks going into the 2021 season of the NFL. What do you guys think? Let me know. Have a good rest of your day.